remember the night I first heard the whispers. I had just started my shift as a night nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, a place with a history thicker than the old oak trees surrounding it. The hospital was ancient, filled with long corridors and dimly lit rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. It was my third week on the job, and exhaustion was a constant companion. Most nights were quiet, with only the occasional beep of a monitor breaking the silence. But that night felt different. As the clock struck midnight, I found myself alone in the West Wing, tasked with checking on the elderly patients. Their frail bodies and wandering eyes seemed lost in their own worlds, but there was one room that stood out. The room at the end of the hall, number 314. Lena was a patient there, an elderly woman with dementia. She was usually peaceful, but tonight she was restless, pacing back and forth, muttering to herself about shadows and voices. Every time I entered her room, she would insist that someone was watching her, a man dressed entirely in black, lurking in the corner. At first, I dismissed it as another symptom of her condition, but the nights began to blur together with the same eerie feeling. One particularly stormy night, the power flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I entered Lena's room to find her more agitated than usual. Her eyes darted around, and she clung to my hand, her voice trembling as she whispered, "He's coming." I tried to comfort her, assuring her that she was safe, that there was no one else in the room. After a while, she seemed to calm down, and I left the room, locking the door behind me. As I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud. The storm outside intensified, rain pounding against the windows and wind howling through the corridors. Returning to the nurse's station, I decided to take a short break in the lounge. The room was deserted, the only light coming from a single lamp hanging overhead. As I sipped my coffee, the temperature seemed to drop. My breath became visible, and an unsettling feeling settled over me. I glanced around, hoping to see another nurse, but there was no one. Suddenly, the phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. I answered it, half expecting it to be a wrong number. But instead, a breathless voice whispered, "He's in room 14." My heart raced. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:15 a.m. Panic set in as I grabbed my flashlight and rushed back down the hall towards Lena's room. As I approached, the whispers started again, faint but unmistakable. "He's here," they seemed to say. I pushed open the door, and the room was as I left it, empty except for Lena, who was now asleep, her hand clutching a worn-out blanket. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight's beam. I fumbled to turn it back on, but it wouldn't activate. In the pitch darkness, I felt a presence behind me, heavy and oppressive. My skin crawled as a shadowy figure took shape in the corner. Tall, cloaked in black, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure began to move towards me, each step echoing in my mind louder than the last. My voice caught in my throat as I whispered, "What do you want?" The figure stopped just inches from me, and a voice, deep and mournful, resonated in my ears. "I was never supposed to leave," it said. "I can't rest." Desperate, I looked around for Lena, but she was gone. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. I remembered the stories about Steen, Mary's, tales of patients who never left, spirits trapped within its walls. Realization hit me. This place was more than just a hospital, it was a prison for tormented souls. Summoning every ounce of courage, I forced myself to stand. "You don't have to stay here. Let me help you." The figure hesitated, and for a moment there was silence. Then, slowly, it began to fade, the oppressive feeling lifting. As the last trace of darkness disappeared, the room brightened, the storm outside calming. I collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. Lena remained asleep, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded. The next morning, the hospital was quiet as always. I never spoke of that night to anyone, not wanting to seem unhinged. But sometimes, when the night is particularly still, I still hear the faint whispers of lost souls, reminding me that St. Mary's holds onto its secrets tightly. To those of you listening, if you ever find yourself alone in a place where shadows linger and the past refuses to let go, remember that some doors should never be opened, and some spirits are best left undisturbed. I remember my first night as a night shift nurse at St. Mercy Hospital. The building loomed tall and silent, its long corridors dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights that seemed to hum with a life of their own. I was exhausted, having worked double shifts the week before, but I pushed through, eager to prove myself. The night started like any other. I checked in with the security guard, a grizzled man named Mr. Harris who rarely spoke, and made my rounds. Most patients were asleep, their steady breathing filling the quiet rooms. But there was one room that always made me uneasy, room 13. The ward was isolated, tucked away from the rest of the hospital, and the stories about it were whispered among the staff. As midnight approached, the silence was broken by the sound of a child's laughter echoing down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:03 am. No pediatric ward was on this floor. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and continued my rounds, trying to ignore the unsettling sound. Returning to the nurse's station, I made a cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would steady my nerves. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My phone buzzed on the counter. No one I knew was messaging me at this hour. Curious, I picked it up. It was a text from an unknown number. 13 needs you. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Storytelling around hospitals often mentioned restless spirits, but I dismissed it as my imagination. Yet, something compelled me to head towards room 13. The hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing unnaturally loud. As I approached the door, I could hear faint whispers and the soft sobbing of a child. The door to room 13 was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly. The room was empty, save for an old, worn-out crib in the corner. The air was thick with an inexplicable tension. I walked towards the crib, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the temperature dropped. My breath became visible, misting in the cold air. I spun around, my flashlight catching a shadow moving swiftly across the room. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. Panic began to set in as I realized I wasn't alone. The crib started to shake violently, rocks tumbling out as if something was trying to break free. Desperate to escape, I backed towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. My mind raced, trying to recall any protocols for such situations, but my training felt miles away. The whispers turned into anguished cries, filling the room with a palpable sorrow. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone again, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. In a moment of sheer terror, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The room seemed to bend and twist, the walls closing in on me. The cries became screams, and the air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. I could feel an invisible force pressing me down, making it hard to breathe. Summoning every ounce of courage, I forced myself to run towards the door. As I touched the handle, a blinding light enveloped the room, and the screams abruptly stopped. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The lights flickered back to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I didn't look back as I hurried to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my ears. Mr. Harris was still there reading his newspaper. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing up at me. I nodded, too shaken to speak. When I finally found my voice, I whispered, "Room 13T. It's not empty." He looked concerned but didn't say anything further. I spent the rest of the night on edge, every shadow and sound heightening my fear. When dawn finally broke, I couldn't wait to leave. As I was about to exit, I glanced back at room 13. For a split second, I saw the faint outline of a child sitting in the crib, watching me with hollow eyes. To this day, I still hear those whispers in the dead of night, and I can't shake the feeling that something left room 13 that night. St. Mercy Hospital closed that wing shortly after, citing safety concerns, but I know it was something far more sinister. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at closed doors, wondering if the spirits still linger, waiting for someone to listen to their silent pleas. I remember the night I started at St. Mercy Hospital like it was yesterday. Fresh out of nursing school, I was eager to make a difference, never anticipating the darkness lurking within those sterile walls. My first shift was during the graveyard hours, the kind that make every creak and whisper feel amplified. Assigned to the psychiatric ward, I thought I was prepared for the usual challenges, but nothing could have prepared me for Mrs. Evelyn. Evelyn was an elderly woman with a gentle smile, often lost in her thoughts. She spent most of her days in a quiet corner, drawing intricate patterns that seemed to mesmerize her. On my first night, around midnight, she called me to her room. "I hear voices," she whispered, her eyes darting to the corner, where shadows seemed to linger longer than it should. I tried to reassure her, reminding her that I was there and she wasn't alone. She nodded, but I could see the fear etched in her lines. Hours passed, and the hospital settled into an uneasy silence. I made my rounds, checking vitals and ensuring every patient was comfortable. Around 3 a.m., as I was stocking the supplies, a chill swept through the corridor. The lights flickered, and an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I shook it off, attributing it to fatigue, and continued my work. Returning to Evelyn's room, I found her sitting up, eyes wide with terror. "He's back," she whispered, pointing to the corner again. Before I could respond, the room grew unbearably cold, and the shadows seemed to coalesce into a figure. A man dressed entirely in black, his face obscured. My heart pounded as he moved closer, his presence suffocating. I reached out to her, trying to pull her away, but the room felt endless, trapping us in a nightmare. Suddenly, the lights snapped back on. The man was gone and Evelyn was trembling on the bed. She gasped, "He doesn't like when I'm awake." I tried to comfort her, promising to stay by her side until morning. But as I turned to leave, I noticed the door had locked itself remotely. Panic surged through me as I pounded on it, but no response came. My phone was dead, and the corridor outside was pitch black. Desperate, I called out to Evelyn for help, but her voice was barely a whisper. "You need to leave before he finds you." I glanced around the room, searching for an exit, but the windows were sealed, and the door wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, and the temperature plummeted again. The shadowed figure materialized once more, moving with a deliberate menace. I backed into a corner, my mind racing for a solution. Remembering the emergency key hidden behind the reception desk, I forced myself to stay calm. "Evelyn, I'm getting help. Just hold on," I said, though my voice cracked with fear. With every ounce of strength, I pushed the heavy furniture away, creating a path toward the door. The figure advanced, its presence a tangible threat, but I refused to give in. My hand grasped the key, and with a frantic twist, the door clicked open. I didn't look back as I sprinted down the corridor, the sound of heavy footsteps chasing me. Every turn felt like a trap, the maze-like layout of the hospital disorienting me. Finally, I burst into the empty lobby, gasping for breath. The automatic doors opened, and I didn't hesitate to run into the cold night, illuminated only by the flickering streetlights. Breathing heavily, I leaned against the police car that had arrived minutes earlier. The officers searched the building, finding no trace of the man in black or any sign of what had transpired. When I returned to the ward the next day, Evelyn was nowhere to be found. Her room was empty, as if she had never been there. The other patients spoke of her sudden disappearance, but no one had any answers. Weeks passed, and strange occurrences became common. Objects moving on their own, whispers echoing through empty halls, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I confided in my colleagues, but they dismissed my experiences as stress from the demanding job. Determined to find answers, I began researching the hospital's history and uncovered a dark secret. Years ago, a patient named Samuel had vanished from the very ward I worked in. Rumors swirled about his disappearance, with some claiming he met a tragic end within those walls. No body was ever found, and the case remained unsolved. The more I delved, the more I felt a connection between Samuel and the malevolent presence haunting us. One night, as I patrolled the ward alone, the shadows seemed alive, swirling with intent. Evelyn appeared briefly, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help him," she whispered before vanishing. Determined to put an end to the terror, I organized a search of the abandoned basement, where Samuel was last seen. Armed with a flashlight, I descended the creaky stairs, the air thick with dread. In the dim light, I found remnants of Samuel's confinement, a broken bed, faded drawings, and a journal detailing his descent into madness. As I read his words, a heavy feeling of despair settled over me. Suddenly, the man in black emerged from the darkness, his presence overwhelming. "Why do you disturb my peace?" he growled, advancing toward me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I confronted him. "Samuel, let him go. Find peace." The room seemed to shrink as our wills clashed. The man hesitated, and I knew this was my chance. I reached out, feeling a surge of energy pass between us. A blinding light filled the space, and when it faded, Samuel was gone, his spirit finally free. Back at the ward, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The shadows retreated, and a sense of calm settled over St. Mercy. Evelyn reappeared, smiling softly before fading away. I realized that by helping Samuel, I had also freed the souls trapped within the hospital. Though peace was restored, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. Mercy Hospital now stands quiet, its dark past laid to rest. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear whispers, reminding me of the thin veil between the living and the restless spirits that once haunted those halls.